The promise was simple. The war ends, oil starts flowing again, prices fall, and yet weeks after the agreement was announced, millions of people are still standing at gas stations, staring at numbers that don't look anything like a collapse. The contradiction is difficult to ignore. A major geopolitical crisis appears to have eased, financial markets celebrated, oil traders reacted instantly, headlines spoke of relief, but the price displayed on the pump moves much more slowly than the headlines. So what happened? If the Strait of Hormuz is open again, if Iranian exports are returning, if oil prices have already fallen from their wartime highs, why are families still paying far more than they expected? And more importantly, what happens next? Because the answer has less to do with politics and far more to do with how modern supply systems actually work. The story begins months before the peace agreement. On February 28, 2026, the conflict escalated dramatically when U.S. and Israeli strikes targeted Iranian military infrastructure. The consequences moved far beyond the battlefield. Iran responded by disrupting traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically important shipping routes on Earth. Roughly 1/5 of global oil supplies normally pass through that narrow waterway. When that flow becomes uncertain, the entire energy system reacts. Traders don't wait for shortages to appear. They price in the possibility of shortages before they happen. Within days, oil markets surged. Brent crude climbed sharply, gasoline prices followed, shipping companies raised risk premiums, insurance costs increased, commodity markets became more volatile. What began as a military conflict rapidly became an economic event. The effects spread across continents. Factories worried about fuel, airlines worried about costs, farmers worried about fertilizer, consumers worried about everything. Then came the blockade. Then came months of uncertainty. And with uncertainty comes something markets dislike more than almost anything else: the inability to predict what happens next. That uncertainty pushed prices higher. Not just oil, everything connected to oil: transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, packaging, distribution. The modern economy runs through energy. When energy becomes unstable, nearly every supply chain feels it. Then, on June 15th, a breakthrough arrived. The peace agreement was announced. The blockade ended. The strait reopened. Markets reacted immediately. Stocks surged, oil prices dropped, commentators began discussing recovery. For many people, the crisis appeared over. But there was a hidden assumption buried inside that optimism. The assumption was that the physical world moves as quickly as financial markets. It doesn't. And that distinction explains almost everything. During negotiations, President Donald Trump repeatedly argued that prices would drop quickly. The phrase that gained attention was simple: prices would drop like a rock. It was an appealing message, straightforward, easy to understand, and partly supported by what happened inside financial markets. Oil prices did fall from their wartime highs, but consumers do not buy barrels of crude oil, they buy gasoline, and between those two things sits an enormous industrial system. As of late June, gasoline prices had fallen from peak levels reached during the crisis, yet they remained significantly elevated compared with where many consumers expected them to be. The gap between expectation and reality created frustration. People could see the deal, they could see the headlines, but they could not yet see the promised relief. This is where the conversation usually becomes political. It shouldn't, because the deeper explanation is structural. The question is not whether somebody wants prices lower. The question is whether the system can deliver lower prices quickly. And right now, there are several reasons it cannot. The first reason sits inside Iran itself: infrastructure damage. When people hear that oil exports are resuming, they often imagine production instantly returning to previous levels. But energy infrastructure does not work that way. Parts of Iran's energy network sustained significant damage during the conflict. Repairs take time, equipment must be replaced, facilities must be inspected, operations must be tested. Workers must return, supply chains must reconnect. Even modest disruptions can reduce output for months. Energy systems are complex machines built across decades. Restarting them is not as simple as flipping a switch. Iran's production already showed signs of strain during the conflict period. That matters because markets are not reacting to theoretical production. They are reacting to actual production. Every barrel that cannot be produced today is a barrel unavailable to the market. The second obstacle is trust, or more accurately, the lack of it. The agreement created a negotiation window. It did not create permanent certainty. From an energy producer's perspective, restarting operations carries costs. Equipment must be brought online. Workers must be rehired, contracts must be restored, transportation networks must be scheduled. Those decisions make sense only if companies believe stability will last. If there is a realistic possibility of renewed conflict, caution becomes rational. Producers know that shutting down and restarting repeatedly is expensive, so many will move carefully, slowly, deliberately, not because they want higher prices, because uncertainty changes incentives. The third obstacle is something most consumers never see: the backlog. Months of disruption created a giant traffic jam inside the global energy system. Millions of barrels became stranded in various stages of transportation, storage, and delivery. Ships were delayed, ports adjusted schedules, refineries changed purchasing plans, inventories shifted. Now that the route is open again, all of that activity must unwind. Imagine closing a major highway for months. Reopening it doesn't instantly erase congestion. Vehicles still need time to reach their destinations. The same principle applies to oil. The reopening solves one problem. It does not immediately erase every consequence created by the closure. Analysts expect months of normalization before inventories and supply chains fully stabilize. The fourth obstacle extends beyond oil itself. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not merely an oil route, it is a trade route, a massive one. Products moving through the Gulf include materials used throughout agriculture and manufacturing. One important example is fertilizer. A significant portion of global fertilizer-related products move through this region. When transportation costs rise, fertilizer costs can rise. When fertilizer costs rise, farming costs increase. When farming costs increase, food prices eventually feel the pressure. This is where the story becomes more personal. A disruption that begins with tankers in the Gulf can eventually influence the price of groceries thousands of miles away, not immediately, gradually, quietly, but persistently. The fifth obstacle is perhaps the least visible: refineries. Even if crude prices decline today, gasoline prices do not instantly mirror that decline. Crude must be purchased, delivered, processed, stored, distributed, and finally sold. Every step requires time. There is a delay built directly into the system. The public often watches oil prices on television and expects gas stations to react the next morning. In reality, the journey from crude oil to fuel pump involves weeks of movement through a highly coordinated industrial chain. The result is a lag, a frustrating lag, but a predictable one. And together, these 5 obstacles explain why prices often fall slower than expectations. Yet gasoline is only part of the story. The larger challenge may be sitting inside grocery stores. Because energy shocks rarely remain confined to energy, they spread. Food prices became one of the most visible pressure points during the conflict period. Transportation became more expensive. Agricultural inputs became more expensive. Distribution became more expensive. Every additional cost had to be absorbed somewhere. Often it was absorbed by consumers. The troubling reality is that prices do not always reverse as quickly as they rise. Businesses frequently adapt to higher costs, then build those costs into future pricing decisions. Once a higher price becomes accepted by the market, the incentive to reduce it weakens. That pattern has appeared before, not only in energy, across multiple industries. A temporary disruption can create permanent pricing changes, which means the question many households are asking may not be whether prices fall, but how much, and how fast, because returning to previous levels is not guaranteed. For families managing budgets, this distinction matters a lot. A 10% increase that becomes permanent changes spending decisions, vacation plans, savings goals, household purchases, lifestyle choices. The pressure accumulates. One expense alone may seem manageable: gas, food, utilities, insurance. But when several categories rise together, households begin making trade-offs. That is where macroeconomics becomes personal. Not in charts, not in forecasts, but in daily decisions. And that brings us to the institution watching all of this most closely: the Federal Reserve. The Fed's challenge is unusually complicated. Oil prices may be easing, but inflation remains elevated. Economic growth still matters. Employment still matters. Consumer spending still matters. Every decision affects something else. Lower energy prices could eventually help reduce inflation pressures. But that process takes time, months, not days. Meanwhile, policymakers must decide whether inflation is cooling fast enough or whether additional restraint is necessary. Markets spent much of 2026 expecting interest rate cuts. Now uncertainty has returned, and uncertainty affects everything from mortgages to auto loans. If rates stay higher for longer, borrowing remains expensive. If rates fall too quickly and inflation resurges, another problem emerges. The Fed is trying to navigate between those risks, and right now neither path looks simple. For ordinary households, the practical implications are straightforward. First, avoid assuming that lower oil prices automatically mean immediate relief everywhere else. The transmission takes time. Second, recognize that borrowing decisions made today are occurring in an environment where interest rate expectations remain uncertain. Third, focus on factors you can control rather than attempting to predict every geopolitical headline, because the next phase of this story will depend on events nobody can forecast with certainty. The ceasefire must hold, infrastructure must recover, supply chains must normalize, inventories must rebuild. Only then can the full economic effects become visible. Which brings us back to the original promise. Will prices eventually fall? Probably. Many already have from their peak levels. Will they drop like a rock? That is a much harder claim to support. The reality is less dramatic and more complicated. The war may have ended. The economic aftershocks have not. Energy systems recover slowly. Supply chains recover slowly. Markets move fast. The physical world does not. That difference explains why a peace agreement can be announced on one day, while consumers continue feeling pressure weeks or even months later. The deeper lesson is that prices are not determined by a single event. They emerge from networks, infrastructure, incentives, trust, logistics, policy, human behavior, all interacting at the same time. And until those systems fully stabilize, the effects of this conflict will continue echoing through the economy, not as headlines, not as breaking news, but as small numbers appearing on gas station signs, grocery receipts, shipping invoices, and monthly bills. The war may be over. The adjustment period is not, and that leaves one final question. Months from now, when people look back at this agreement, will it be remembered as the beginning of a rapid recovery, or simply the first step in a much longer return to normal? Only time will answer that, but the pace of that answer will likely be much slower than most people expect.